Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the Worker Protection Act, how to prevent sexual harassment in your workplace and comply with the new legislation. My name is Nick Henderson Mayo, and I am joined today by our course development expert, Maurizio Caldera. Hi, Maurizio.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for inviting me on today.
And Maurizio will be taking us through some of these reasonable steps that businesses should be taking in light of the new law. And also joining us is Naomi Grossman, our compliance and legislation expert, who will guide us through the ins and outs of the Worker Protection Act. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, Nick. I'm excited to be here, and there's a lot to talk about today.
Absolutely. And we also know there's also a lot of expertise within the audience as well today. We're delighted to be joined by some very prestigious organizations, international law firms, leading businesses, and we would love to hear from you. What are you planning to do to comply with the new Worker Protection Act? What steps have you already taken? And are you thinking about further steps ahead, depending on what we see coming next in the world of sexual harassment compliance? Because we will also be talking today about the new Employment Rights Bill that was published just a few weeks ago and contains more requirements for employers to think about on the topic of sexual harassment. We will be getting into the detail of all of that over the next hour. And please do ask us any questions you like during this webinar using the chat or Q&A function on Zoom. We'll get back to as many of them as we can during the webinar. If we don't manage to get to your specific question today, we will get back to you by email. So please do write to us and we will love to hear from you. We're going to start this webinar with a short trailer highlighting our new sexual harassment course, and it really shows the importance of the issue that we're here to discuss today. And just before we play that, though, I want to make everyone aware that we are discussing, obviously, a very difficult subject. It can be upsetting. If you feel like you need to leave the webinar at any time, please do so. You will get a recording. You can catch up later on the things we discussed. So if this is in any way upsetting or difficult, we completely understand if you want to step away and come back to this later on.
I was standing next to a senior member of staff and he started to sort of run his finger up the back of my leg.
He was scrolling through to try and find pictures of his penis, and he said, "I'll show you mine if you show me yours."
Lots of people say things like, "It was just a joke, I didn't mean it, you know, you're too uptight," or "I'm just a kind of friendly, outgoing guy."
I think the genie is out of the bottle in terms of understanding of quite how prevalent and also quite how destructive sexual harassment in the workplace is. We have had a number of global and international surveys recently which really lay bare the extent of the problem and the impact that it has on victims.
You're always so tense. Honestly, look at you.
Nothing happened when we were together, but outside of work he would be pressurising me to meet.
And he made a number of comments along the lines of, "That's not true, you don't look gay. Do you want to come back with me tonight and I'll show you?"
As opposed to being reactive and thinking about defending claims, all employers now need to proactively think about how they can reduce the risk of sexual harassment happening.
So what are you studying then?
I'm doing engineering.
Engineering? Don't tell me you're going to hide that gorgeous body underneath a boiler suit all day. Shouldn't be allowed.
She said, so in 2 weeks it's your last day here. We should have sex and no one will ever have to find out about it.
For employers to be able to get ahead of this is stay on track, stay up to date with these changes, and I'd also recommend having someone, a named individual in your business who's responsible for keeping track of this and making sure that you remain compliant.
So obviously some quite distressing issues that are raised in that trailer. We are going to spend a bit more time throughout the webinar looking at some more of those videos that we use in the training course and discussing how they can be used effectively. It is obviously a difficult subject, but as we all know, it's sadly an issue that is very prevalent across society and in the workplace. And even though it can be upsetting, we do all have a responsibility to make sure these things don't occur in the workplace. You'll have seen a few of the subject matter experts in that trailer who we'll be seeing more of today as we share some clips. Those are Michael Conroy, who is the founder of the organization Men at Work. Dr. Helen Mott is a women's rights consultant and expert in sexual harassment and its prevention. And Natasha Adom, who is a partner and head of training at GQ Littler, and they feature extensively in the course along with other subject matter experts. If you do want to see more of the sexual harassment courses that we've got, you can write the word demo into the chat and we'll be in touch to set up that demo. We have a range of different courses depending on the type of organization, industry. For example, we have different video courses for the higher and further education sector and sexual harassment as well. But Naomi, let's start with what the Worker Protection Amendment to Equality Act 2010-2023 Act, to give it its full title, what that actually says and does, because it's more the start of a new legislative drive to stamp out sexual harassment as opposed to an endpoint.
Thanks, Nick. And just to add to what the trailer we saw highlights, although we're going to be talking about technical points of law in this webinar, we should never forget that this is about people, and it's all about protecting people in the workplace. But it's a good way to look at the Worker Protection Act as the start of a process of more regulation around sexual harassment. There's been some confusion to the act, in part because so much was taken out on a journey towards through Parliament. What's also really interesting is that the Worker Protection Act was never a government bill. It began life as a private member's bill introduced by Liberal Democrat MP Wira Hobhouse. And I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Interestingly, the Carers Leave Act, another piece of legislation we talked about recently on a webinar, was also a Liberal Democrat private member's bill. So the Workers' Protection Act was passed in November of 2023 under the previous conservative government, and a lot of the initial proposals in draft versions of the bill were taken out. For instance, explicit protections against third-party harassment were removed. We do have some guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission that does give us more context about the Act and how we can apply it, and we'll be coming onto that in more detail during this webinar. So normally we wouldn't need to think too much about what's been taken out of a piece of legislation, but because the Employment Rights Bill was published a few weeks ago, which brings back some of these issues, I think it's really good to highlight that some of those aspects of the bill that were taken out will very likely return in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much. That's a very, very good point. And we're going to be looking at what the Employment Rights Bill has in store for sexual harassment a bit later in this webinar, alongside what employers should be doing for the new Worker Protection Act now, because there are quite a few things that we do have to pay attention to, and more of that will be coming down the line, including some of these things that were originally taken out of the Worker Protection Act.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. Firstly, the scope of the harassment, which is covered. Initially, it was supposed to include harassment based on any protected characteristic, like race or religion, but this was removed. Even harassment related to sex. So, for instance, sexism or misogyny wasn't included in the law. Only harassment which is specifically of a sexual nature is included in the Worker Protection Act. So, secondly, explicit protection from third-party harassment. So from clients or customers or members of the public, that was also taken out. But this is discussed in the EHRC guidance. So it gets a bit complicated, and we'll come on to that in more detail later, like we said, because that's coming back in the Employment Rights Bill. Also removed was the need for employers to take all reasonable steps. The word all was removed by the House of Lords. So this means businesses need to proactively take some reasonable steps, but not all, which is another thing that the new government has committed to bringing back in the Employment Rights Bill.
Thanks for that. And yes, we certainly will get into the issue of third-party harassment and the Employment Rights Bill and what that's going to mean. So Maurizio, whether or not it's all reasonable steps or just reasonable steps, take us through what some of those steps actually include that we as organizations and employers need to think about.
Sure. So the first thing I'd say before we get to reasonable steps is that the key difference between the new legislation, you heard Natasha Adom say it in that trailer, So the new legislation or amendment to the Equality Act 2010, and what was previously in place, is that whilst in the past you had to demonstrate that you had taken reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment only in the event that a claim was made against you or within your organisation, now you have to take those reasonable steps irrespective of any claim. In other words, proactively. So all employers, all organisations will have to demonstrate that they've taken reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment irrespective of the circumstances. That is the key difference. The nature of the reasonable steps will not necessarily have changed that much from then to now. And I'm possibly going on a limb here by saying that a lot of organisations were probably covering many of those reasonable steps anyway. I mean, we'll be asking you some questions later today on how much was being covered in terms of these steps. You may prove me wrong. I hope you don't. Now, the duty on third-party liability has not changed, as Naomi was saying. There is no duty on third-party liability. It's actually a little bit more complex than that, in fact, and we will discuss that in more detail later. But we would strongly advise that you err on the side of caution when it comes to third parties and incorporate reasonable steps when it comes to third parties. Not only are you offering further protection to your staff, but you'll get ahead of the Employment Rights Bill, which is coming down the track, which we've been talking about. Same thing applies to the all reasonable steps as opposed to just reasonable steps, which has just been mentioned. Again, err on the side of caution for the same reasons. Bear in mind, I know it's been said, but worth reiterating that today we're talking about the Worker Protection Act, but we're keeping an eye on the Employment Rights Bill too, which everyone should be aware of. And in addition to that, we will be looking at best practice. So what can you do above and beyond, or at least thinking beyond the duty and reasonable steps when it comes to training?
Thank you very much for that. Very, very, very useful to know. And on that note, let's now go through some of those reasonable steps that we might take to prevent sexual harassment taking place.
Sure. So the starting point for all organisations is to assess the risk of sexual harassment occurring in the first place. So what are the risks and where might they be? What are your activities? Identifying where those risks will arise. And obviously that will be different for different types of business. So public facing organisations, for instance, will likely have a different set of risks. Those who deal extensively in person with third parties, contractors, stakeholders will also need to assess their risks. The point being that for all organisations, the risk will be different. So all employers need to do an audit of their activities and identify the risks. Another factor when considering reasonable steps is the size of an organisation. So obviously larger organisations are expected to do more than smaller ones, for instance.
It really seems that the focus on this guidance is thinking about the sexual harassment risk present in the workplace and then thinking about all the ways you might do to prevent that.
Yeah, completely. So undertaking risk assessments for each area of the business and really thinking about the nature and type of harassment that might occur is critical. That means that all organisations will have to be proactive in that respect. Now, when thinking about the more general reasonable steps, the place to start is policies, obviously. So all organisations should have a robust sexual harassment policy in place. And crucially, everyone should be aware of it. So ensuring that you're communicating it is a reasonable step in itself and one you will want to demonstrate. What is the policy? How are you communicating it? To whom and how often? The next follow-on step from that is going to be training. So what sexual harassment training do you deliver? How thorough is it? How often are you delivering it and to whom? And of course, obviously that training should include lots of things, but certainly should cover what sexual harassment is, including some things that some people might not expect, such as inappropriate use of social media, sharing images, all that kind of stuff. And all that would need to be unpacked in the training. The next step then is, what are your processes for reporting? So what do people in these instances do, whether it's happened to you or whether it's something you've observed happening to someone else? Where and how do you report that? Is there a named individual or department who looks into this, which again, Natasha Adam was referring to in the trailer? And crucially on that point, yet again, how are you making your staff aware of it? It's all very well to have thought through these things, but you need to ensure that everyone is aware of it because, of course, apart from anything else, there is a deterrent aspect to that. It sends a strong signal, if you're talking about this and you're communicating that there are these robust policies in place and procedures. And finally is regular assessment of all of the above. Are these steps working? How do you know they're working? Are you assessing them? Are you surveying your staff? What questions are you asking? And are you ensuring anonymity in those surveys? And this question of anonymity is something that will be different if you're part of a larger organization where you can survey anonymously, as opposed to a smaller one where you might want to take a different approach to these surveys.
Excellent point. Thank you very, very much for that. Very interesting. Thank you. Let's ask our first poll question now of the audience about these kinds of reasonable steps. And if this is an area you feel will need more work to put things in, now the new law is in place. So the poll question coming up on the screen now. How confident are you that your organization has effective measures to prevent sexual harassment? Completely confident, fairly confident, somewhat confident, slightly confident, not confident at all. So thinking about the situation you're in now, how confident are you that your organization currently has effective measures to prevent sexual harassment? Completely confident, fairly, somewhat, slightly, or not confident at all. So we're going to give that poll another moment for everyone to have a chance to answer. And then we'll have a look at the results. So 5% say completely confident, 45% say fairly confident, 35% somewhat confident, 10% slightly confident, and 4% not confident at all. Very interesting set of results there. I think it shows where a lot of us at really, where we think we're doing the right thing, but it's probably worthwhile thinking through, is that actually, are we doing enough?
Yeah. No, it's true. They really are interesting. And it shows that actually going through the process of undertaking risk assessments for different parts of the business and different types of employees and job roles can actually really help increase confidence levels, because you might already be taking all the steps you can be, and knowing that and communicating to your staff regularly that you do have proactive measures to prevent sexual harassment can help to make everyone feel more secure at work.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that. Let's now take a look at another video from the course that looks at some of the issues around sexual harassment in the workplace. And just before we play it, though, I want to remind everyone, obviously, this is a really difficult subject. We're going to be looking at a drama here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about why we've done the training in that way shortly. But remember, you will receive the recording after and can catch up later in the things we discuss. So if this is in any way upsetting or difficult, please step out and we can come back to that later. Let's take a quick look at that clip just now.
Sexual harassment will probably take place if there is no conscious decision by influential people in a workplace to eradicate it and to challenge it, because it's the fruit of disrespectful ways of acting and behaving in broader society that are brought into the workplace.
Yeah, his daughter's on work experience this week. Proper little schoolgirl. I said I'd be more than happy to teach you. You know what I mean? Speak of the devil.
I've come to get some hex shank drill bits to send over to the Beckenham branch. They've run out.
Hex shank drill bits, eh? Right there, love.
I can't.
Oh, nah, they're over there, love.
So, how was your first day in the world of work?
Fine.
Well, what were you doing?
Do we have to talk about it now, Dad? Can we just go home, please?
What's wrong?
Nothing, it's fine.
So unless workplaces or universities or whatever the forum may be consciously acknowledge the scale of the problem and the dynamics and the causes of the problem, then probably we're never going to move beyond the sticking plaster situation, when really we want to stop things happening in the first place.
So, I finally got it out of her. She says Charlie tried to take an upskirt photo of her in the workshop. I didn't find it very funny, Colin.
I just think you're having a bit of a sense of humour failure because she's your daughter, Mike. Come on.
So what are you going to do about it?
Okay, well, stop her visiting the workshop then. She can stay upstairs with Heather and the girls in the office for the rest of the week.
If you're not going to do anything about it, I will.
Right. You want to bang heads together, you carry on. I've got better things to do.
Probably the biggest cause is a sense of entitlement on the part of the person who's perpetrating that behaviour. So entitlement to have access to bodies or entitlement to behave in certain ways towards other people.
So that was a clip from one of the videos of our new sexual harassment course. If you'd like to know more about that course or see more about it, you can write demo into the chat box. We'll set that up for you. Maurizio, we saw there in that video a mix of drama, but also a mix of expertise and expert advice. Tell us a little bit more about how these courses are constructed and developed. What's the thought process behind that?
Sure. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with our training and our courses, a lot of our courses combine drama scenarios, also with lived experience interviews and subject matter expert interviews. We think that demonstrating behaviours in dramas is a really powerful tool across the board anyway, but I would say that possibly nowhere more so than in the context of sexual harassment, where I think talking in the abstract or in legal terms only takes you so far. In dramas, you observe the scenarios like you've just done, you know, the nuances, the language, the context, and crucially, the emotion. You know, that's why we watch drama, because the emotions resonate for us, which is what we want. We want to be able to connect and create empathy. With that in mind, you know, in the drama you've just seen, I'd highlight a couple of things. In the first part of the drama, you will have noted maybe the performative nature of the upskirting by the perpetrator. You know, he's performing it for his colleague. He's doing it himself, but he's performing it for him because he thinks it's okay to. You might also have noticed that his colleague is not entirely comfortable with this act of sexual harassment, yet he went along with it. We'll talk a bit more later about the role of bystanders, but the point being that we all play a role here. He could have shut that down, but he didn't. And then, of course, there's the manager who doesn't want to do anything because it was just a bit of fun. It's, you know, that whole it's not ideal, but you know, no real harm done, that kind of logic, which unfortunately is very prevalent. And, you know, I have to say can be quite compelling as well. I'm sure many of you will know this, but really it's important to reiterate it's a crucial part of the training that when we're legally defining sexual harassment, it's not the intention that matters, but the effect on the victim. So that whole, it was just a bit of fun, all of that is not an argument. You will have seen the effect on the young woman and how distressed she was. That in itself is enough. And just to add, upskirting is a criminal offence. There should have been serious consequences here, but there weren't.
Thank you very much for taking us through that, and I'm sure it was, you know, not an easy course to put together, but certainly a very well done way to highlight these issues and bring them up in that context. So thank you very much for putting that together. And Naomi, that can be a hard thing to manage from the compliance point of view. How do we assess if training is working, and how do we assure that the message that's coming through is something that people are going to take note of?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's a very tricky approach because it's often about perception. People perceive that harassment is common in action, then that really helps harassment thrive. If people don't think their experiences will be taken seriously, they just won't report the harassment. And then this perpetuates a culture of workplace abuse, and it entrenches the harassers in positions of power. Abusers are really bullies who will aggressively target those speak out against them. So to protect people who've been harassed and not blame them, then that's crucial to tackling the harassment. There's actually been research carried out that shows a clear chain of escalating workplace harassment. Abusers will often start with inappropriate touching and move on to more aggressive behaviors if they think they can get away with it. This is impacted by things like their position of authority or power, the culture of the workplace, and the willingness of people to actually speak out and call them on it.
Yeah. And obviously training can't exist in a vacuum, can it? We also need to think about reporting mechanisms, things like whistleblower tools, to make sure that there is a process to raise concerns and there's also confidence in people that these things will be addressed.
Yes, exactly. So again, part of the problem is that many people fear coming forward after they've experienced or even witnessed harassment. So training is as much about giving people safe space to report the harassment and understand what will happen when they do and make them feel confident that these complaints will be addressed. So one of the reasons why sexual harassment is so prevalent is that people often don't come forward because they worry it won't be taken seriously. That's why having clear training, which shows how different examples and policies that explain the consequences and are clear about the procedures is so, so important. There was some very interesting analysis by Elizabeth Tippett from the University of Oregon. This showed that sexual harassment training, which focuses on narrow legalistic definitions and obscure and unlikely scenarios of misconduct, just doesn't work. What we need is effective training and policies that show that there are safe ways to report, that people won't be victimized, and also that those who perpetrated the harassment will actually face consequences.
Very, very important points there. And, we haven't quite yet touched on the issue in investigations and what happens as a consequence of these reports. But one of the videos that we have to show from the new course touches on some of those points. So let's take a little look at that clip just now.
In order to tackle sexual harassment effectively, organisations need to have specific standalone policies that clearly define sexual harassment and explain how organisations will respond to complaints.
Thinking about specific policies to address sexual harassment, it's important to give plenty of information that defines what sexual harassment is very clearly, the range of sexual harassment, because there is a very broad range of behaviours that we are talking about when we talk about sexual harassment. It's also important to set out and define consequences and sanctions very clearly, and then to make sure that the consequences that are spoken about in the policy are delivered day to day by the organisation.
Lucy claims that you patted her on the backside and made several inappropriate and unwelcome comments about her appearance. Do you remember that?
All right, yes. I mean, I've already apologised to Lucy. I mean, I didn't mean to upset her.
The kind of behaviour that you exhibited towards Lucy is completely unacceptable, as our bullying and harassment policy makes very clear.
Historically, sexual harassment has often been lumped in organisational policy with bullying and harassment generally. There are several reasons why that's not a very good idea, but perhaps one very specific and important thing to point out is that mediation is often seen as a good informal first step response to bullying in the workplace. However, mediation is really rarely suitable in cases of sexual harassment in the workplace, and that's the reason why it needs separate policy, and it would be important not to talk about mediation as a first step in any sexual harassment policy. Because of the issues and the barriers around reporting and getting information about sexual harassment in the workplace, it should be very clear that when somebody makes a report into the organisation, they're going to be somewhat in control of the process. We don't want victims to fear losing yet more control over the process. So a victim-led, trauma-informed process should be at the heart of a good policy.
So, let me just read you our sexual harassment policy, which you should be familiar with from your induction, but just in case it slipped your mind, I'll refresh your memory. We are committed to providing a safe environment for all our employees and customers, free from discrimination on any ground and from harassment at work, including sexual harassment. And we will operate a zero tolerance policy for any form of sexual harassment in the workplace, and treat all incidents seriously and promptly investigate all allegations of sexual harassment. Any person found to have sexually harassed another will face disciplinary action. up to and including dismissal from employment.
Policies should also set out the range of disciplinary sanctions that can be imposed on those who sexually harass.
So there we saw just that combination of expert advice and drama, which we use in our training courses. Please do write demo if you'd like a bit more information about those courses or to see that in more detail. You can also download our dedicated guide to the Worker Protection Act. The link is coming up in the chat now. But if you have any trouble accessing that link, let us know and we will either give you an alternative or email you out the guide. But that guide is updated with the latest information on the Worker Protection Act and covers a lot more than what we're able to get through at the moment, but certainly around the issues that we've been talking about, it should help within that process of thinking through reasonable steps. So let's just ask another poll question of the audience now. Does your organization currently have a separate sexual harassment policy in place? Yes, and it is regularly updated. Yes, but it's outdated. No, we don't have one, or I'm not sure. So does your organization currently have a separate sexual harassment policy in place? Yes, and it is regularly updated. Yes, but it's outdated. No, we don't have one, meaning we don't have a separate sexual harassment policy, or not sure. So we're going to give another few moments for everyone to have a chance to answer that poll and get a sense of how well we're doing in terms of policies and what kinds of policies we have and whether or not they are separate from the broader policies that we've got in place. So 25% saying yes and it's regularly updated, 9% yes but outdated, 53% no we don't have one or that it's not standalone and separate, and 13% not sure. Interesting set of results there, Maurizio. What's your take on that?
They are, and I think you've just seen in the video the compelling reasons why there should be a separate sexual harassment policy, particularly obviously one that's not lumped in with a general harassment policy because of that the point you highlighted about mediation is just one of the reasons why they require different approaches.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you very much. Very, very good point to remember as we go forward that it does require a separate policy and a separate process to think about. Let's just take a step back for a moment and remind ourselves of why this is such an important topic to get right, because the scale of sexual harassment is really quite frightening.
Yeah, no, it really is. Sexual harassment has been a persistent problem in UK workplaces. A 2023 report from the Fawcett Society revealed that 40% of women experience sexual harassment at some point in their lives, while a TUC study found that 79% of people do not report their experiences. That's really, really high. In the healthcare sector, nearly 1 in 10 NIH staff reported facing sexual harassments from patients or the public in 2023, meaning third parties. A survey conducted by the BBC found that 40% of women and 18% of men had experienced unwanted sexual behavior at work, and younger women were particularly vulnerable. So it's really after the Me Too movement, which gained global attention in 2017, that it helped play a pivotal role in raising awareness about workplace harassment, especially sexual harassment. In the UK, the movement brought about kind of a cultural reckoning where people began to speak out more openly about their experiences of abuse and misconduct in the workplace. This is where a lot of the pressure came from employers and parliament to address systemic issues that allowed harassment to persist kind of unchecked.
Yeah, and a lot of that was, I think, because of the inability to report things, wasn't it? Encouraging people to actually share what they've experienced in a safe manner. A lot of the time that didn't exist in many places, and things like whistleblowing is one of the key ways that we can ensure that complaints will be taken seriously. There are already separate requirements on many organizations to have standalone whistleblowing policies and reporting mechanisms. How can having a robust whistleblowing policy and procedure support preventing sexual harassment in the workplace?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, as we mentioned earlier, when employees trust that their concerns will be taken seriously and handled discreetly, they're much more likely to come forward. This means you can better address issues early before they escalate into more serious problems, and they can get really, really serious. Early intervention not only prevents further harassment, but also sends a clear message that the organization is committed to maintaining a safe and respectful workplace. Also, when these concerns are handled early and effectively, it's just going to have a better outcome. Obviously, it's awful if it happens, but actually, that's why we have these steps in place to deal with it. Handle it early, reduce the damage that can happen, and make sure it doesn't progress to something much worse. Strong whistleblowing policies and procedures help organizations identify patterns of behavior, also problematic individuals, or high-risk areas that could otherwise go unnoticed. By encouraging reports from all employees, including bystanders, and people who have seen something, even if they aren't directly impacted themselves, you really get insights into the broader workplace culture, and you can take corrective measures to reduce the risks. This proactive approach helps ensure that sexual harassment is just not tolerated and allows employers to take action like revising policies, improving training, or addressing gaps in supervision.
Thank you very much for that. And if you'd like to know more about whistleblowing procedures in general, or to chat about how whistleblowing systems can be adapted for sexual harassment, you can write the word OmniTrack into the chat, and we'll be in touch to discuss our whistleblowing software and training, which is called OmniTrack. Since we're talking about training, let's also now ask about the sexual harassment training that you have in your own workplace. So the next poll that we've got coming up in the coming up on your screen now, how would you rate the sexual harassment training in your workplace? Excellent, good, okay, it could be better, not good, we don't do training. So how would you rate the sexual harassment training in your current or in your own workplace? Excellent, good, okay, it could be better, not good, or we don't do training. So we'll give everyone a moment to think about the training that they currently do around sexual harassment, and how well or not well it is. And then we will see the results in just a moment. Get it up on the screen. So 2% saying excellent, so that's really, really good to see. 18% have say the good sexual harassment training. 30% okay, could be better. 10% not good, and 40% we don't do training. Maurizio, again, interesting set of results from see where we all are at in terms of the steps that we're taking to prevent sexual harassment.
I mean, in all honesty, I'm surprised to see the 40% we don't do anything. That does surprise me. And between that and the not good, that's half. So that is a concern. I mean, it is worth saying that sexual harassment is not an easy subject to train effectively on. It's obviously an uncomfortable and sensitive subject. But I think as opposed to an overly legalistic tick box exercise, we want this kind of training to engage people and make them think. There was a question in the chat earlier on about, ways of being proactive. Is the training, just the procedures when sexual harassment is perpetrated, or are there more kind of, proactive measures that you can take in the training? And I think a good way of doing this is maybe incorporating bystander intervention training, because it makes everyone an active participant. Because in this context, when we're talking about reasonable steps, we're talking on an organizational level, things like policies and processes, all that kind of stuff, which obviously are crucial. But what about people? What can people do? And bystander intervention is much more focused on people.
Fascinating. Thank you very much for that. And let's now take a quick look at one of the videos from the course which demonstrates the value of bystander interventions in this context.
A really important part of bystander intervention training, and one that is often overlooked, is how to listen, how to be a good friend, how to be a good colleague, and how to support victims.
We saw what happened there. We both saw it, yeah? That is really, really not okay.
Do you want to go and report it? Because we'll go with you if you want.
It's up to you. Yeah.
Bystanders can intervene in a number of different ways, and the most effective approach will obviously depend on the situation.
For example, using humour can help to reduce tension and make it easier to get your point across.
Bringing it home stops the person from distancing themselves from the impact of their actions or dehumanizing their victims.
We're friends, right? Appealing to someone as a friend shows that you care about the way they are perceived by others.
That's just weird. Giving normative feedback can help put unacceptable behaviour in context.
There's safety and power in numbers. So, intervening as a group gives you a strong basis for action and can be particularly effective with someone who displays a pattern of behaviour.
Somebody in the workplace who's witnessing problematic behaviour shouldn't have to feel that it's necessarily down to them to take appropriate action. It's also can be very helpful for people to understand that they can delegate that responsibility to take the problem to somebody in a position of authority or management who will be able to take on the issue and deal with it appropriately through the line management structure.
So that was a clip from our new sexual harassment course on the topic of bystander intervention, which is one of the ways that you might support staff to help prevent sexual harassment and take action if they see it. Maurizio, just give us an overview though of what bystander intervention is if we're not familiar with the subject.
So bystander intervention training is designed really to equip all of us, so all employees in this context, with the knowledge and skills to safely and effectively intervene in situations where there's harm, harassment, or violence, or where they may occur. So the idea is that it sees learners as partners working together to solve a problem. And this approach encourages people to be vigilant and active players in stopping inappropriate comments and behaviour. Because, you know, the point is that you can't monitor everything all the time. Neither do you just want to take action in the event of harassment occurring, but it allows people to see themselves as part of the solution and to create safe spaces. At the same time, it's reaffirming these appropriate and inappropriate behaviours to yourself, to the learner.
That can be a tough situation to put staff into, can't it? If we see something uncomfortable or upsetting, we might be inclined to, to ignore it, not to make a fuss, especially if we aren't too sure exactly how to help or if we're afraid of making things worse.
Sure, and that fear is exactly why doing training like that can be very effective, because it gives you the tools and techniques with which to reduce that sense of trepidation. It typically focuses on developing skills such as recognizing warning signs, assessing risks, and employing appropriate strategies to intervene. That said, as you heard Helen Mott say in the video there, no one should feel pressure to intervene, but it does give you the tools to, at the very least, understand situations better. You know, it might be that you're the sort of person who would intervene anyway, and it means that your intervention might be more effective.
And Naomi, let's say we want to add bystander intervention training as one of the reasonable steps that we want to take to prevent sexual harassment. How would we go about doing that?
So there's some critical features that good bystander training should have. So first, the training should cover the correct problem-solving tools and know how to get involved and take responsibility. They should also know how and who to report to when necessary. Obviously, it's always much easier to stay quiet than to speak up in difficult situations. For bystander intervention to really work, trainees have to be exposed to many different and varied types of situations where insensitive behavior might occur. And then they have adequate opportunities to learn what the correct response would be in those situations. They also have the chance to test themselves to see whether they have learned how to respond correctly and effectively.
We also want to then, I think, see examples from managers and leaders as well that, they're encouraged to speak up in these kinds of situations. And let's actually ask the audience about that as well. Do you currently offer bystander intervention training. Yes, we do it as part of our yearly training. Yes, we did it once. Not yet, but would like to. No plans to do so, or not sure. So, in terms of bystander intervention training, do you currently offer bystander intervention training? Yes, it's part of our yearly training. Yes, we did it once. Not yet, but would like to. No plans to do so, or not sure. So, very interesting to hear from the audience about this topic and what people may or may not have in place around that. So, let's give that poll just another moment, and we will see what comes up as a result. So 9% are doing bystander intervention training as part of their yearly training. 8% did it once. 41% not yet, but would like to. 23% no plans to do so. 19% not sure. Interesting results there again, Maurizio. What should firms think about when they want to implement bystander intervention training?
I mean, as I said earlier, it's really about putting people at the center of the conversation. It invites everyone to invest in creating safer spaces at work. I just add to that, to the thing that actually Naomi mentioned earlier on that we haven't really explored much, is the idea of workplace culture. And then if you work in a culture where a certain kind of sexual banter and jibes takes place and is accepted, it's perhaps more likely that sexual harassment will take place. And we're all agents of the culture that we operate in. And bystander training makes that individual contribution much more active and considered. It gives us responsibility, which is really powerful, I think.
Thank you very much for that. And we'll take now just a very short look at a clip from the bystander intervention course that we have available as well.
We are all bystanders in our everyday and working lives. And as such, we have a crucial role to play in stepping up and speaking out when we witness inappropriate behaviour.
So there's a very important role for bystander intervention in the workplace context, and we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it can feel for people to challenge behaviour constructively.
So sometimes, even if people witness inappropriate behaviour, they may not feel able to intervene. One of these reasons might be a visceral fear that they are going to draw the fire on themselves. If someone is in a very aggressive state, it can be very frightening to think they might turn that aggression on you. It can be the case that I don't feel I have enough positional power. In other words, the other person is so much more powerful than me that if I call them out, I am the one who will suffer, I am the one who will lose my job, and I just can't take that risk.
There are many different ways in which bystanders can intervene effectively to challenge inappropriate behaviour, and the best approach will depend on the situation.
I think sometimes people have an idea in their head that a bystander intervention is a kind of in-the-moment confrontation. Hang on a minute, what are you doing? Stop that right now. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like that. There are all kinds of different ways. They can be direct or indirect. So somebody witnessing a problematic behaviour could choose to speak at the time with the person who's perpetrating that behaviour, or they may wait and speak to the person privately later. They may delegate, so they may take the problem to somebody in a position to be able to do something about it as a manager, for example, or somebody with specialist knowledge of the area.
We all have a collective responsibility, and our little piece of information about somebody or some activity could, if joined together with other people's little pieces of information, create a really clear picture of somebody who has abusive behaviour over time and who really needs to be challenged and checked and stopped.
So that was a clip from our bystander intervention course there, which is applicable to all types of harassment, workplace issues, not just sexual harassment. And you can obviously let us know if you'd like to see more about that. And please also write your questions in as we go through. So Naomi, just to remind ourselves of the actual requirements to comply with the Worker Protection Act, what specifically do we need to be doing now to comply with the Worker Protection Act?
So it's actually about a shift in mindset for employers. Instead of just being reactive and defending claims of sexual harassment, We need to be proactive and think about how we can actually reduce the risk of it happening. It's a positive obligation to do something instead of just doing things after the fact. You have to demonstrate that those measures have actually been taken. So you want to show that there is an anti-harassment policy that's known to employees and sets out standards of behavior. You'll also need a very robust complaints process that we talked about before. And of course, undertake training to make sure everyone knows their rights, knows what's expected, and knows how to respond if they see anything.
And a lot of it is about understanding the risks within your organization, isn't it? Figuring out where those high risk areas might be and what kind of risk factors will exist and how to deal with them.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's going to be different for every employer. A restaurant or nightclub is going to face different risks than a law firm or a factory. So that's why it's up to each employer to figure that out based on their own knowledge of their own organization. A really good way to start is with the risk assessment, and probably several risk assessments if you have different sites, different types of workers, or different risks that are present. Back office staff probably have a different risk than public facing staff, for instance, or salespeople who are traveling a lot will have their own specific risks. You then want to consider what steps you could take to reduce those risks and prevent sexual harassment, and look at what steps would just be reasonable to take.
Maurizio, what about the issue of third-party harassment that we talked about earlier? So when harassment is conducted by a client or a customer or someone who's not employed.
So this is a complicated area because, as Naomi mentioned earlier on, originally it was in the draft of the legislation, but was taken out of the Worker Protection Act before it was passed. So currently employers are not automatically liable for third-party harassment unless they fail to act due to a worker's protected characteristic, and that could be race, age, or of course gender. That is supposed to cover sexual harassment, but it's not explicit in the law, at least not at the moment, and that's the issue. Now, the new government has said that they were going to bring that back, and in fact, they have included specific protections against third-party harassment in the new Employment Rights Bill. Obviously, it's early days; it's in draft form, and it's a long way from being passed. And even if it does, it isn't likely to come into force until at least 2026. That said, it's a good idea to start thinking about these things, the risks that third parties might bring, what kind of risks are associated. And to start thinking about what reasonable steps you want to take in that area, because it can be more complex than those other risks that we talked about earlier on. Again, think about the risk assessments you're carrying out anyway, and include risks from third parties in that audit. If you have members of the public coming in and out of your workplace, for instance, then you might need to invest in more signs, perhaps stating clearly that harassment won't be tolerated. You might want cameras to monitor any dangers to staff or ensure that frontline staff have adequate training specific for their role. Things like that might be reasonable steps in this context.
Yeah. And let's ask the audience about that now very quickly in our last poll of the day. Are you addressing third-party harassment currently in your reasonable steps? So we are including it. We're in the process of including it. Not yet, but we plan to soon. No plans to include it or not sure. So are you addressing third-party harassment in your reasonable steps? Yes, we're already including it. We're in the process of including it. Not yet, but we plan to soon. No plans to include it now or not sure. So let's give everyone just a quick moment to answer that question. We'll see the results pop up on the screen. An even or so-ish mix there. 16% are currently including it. 22% are in the process. 24% not yet, but plan to. 10% no plans to include it now. And 28% not sure. So we mentioned the Employment Rights Bill at the start of this webinar, and although, as you said, Maurizio, it's only just been published, still has some way to go, it does set out the direction of travel around regulating sexual harassment.
That's right. So the duty to prevent sexual harassment by third parties is included in the Employment Rights Bill. So employers will have a duty to prevent harassment of their employees from third parties, such as clients, contractors, and members of the public. And similar to the failure to prevent legislation around bribery and fraud, an employer will be liable for third-party harassment if they fail to take all reasonable steps to prevent the harassment from happening. And on that note, that's another change from the Worker Protection Act. The Employment Rights Bill requires employers to take all reasonable steps, as opposed to just the reasonable steps, to prevent sexual harassment. The current draft of the bill also requires the government to set out what steps will be considered reasonable within regulation. So this will put reasonable steps such as risk assessments, policies and training on a statutory footing. As we've said, it's early days, it's just been published as a draft and there will be consultations on it over the next year. We'll bring you more information on exactly what will be required, and you'll have to think about the things you'll have to think about as the legislation progresses.
So in this future employment rights bill, even if it's not enforced for at least the next few years, we will get actual regulation around what steps are considered reasonable.
We will get that from the new legislation, but we can assume from the guidance already published that these reasonable steps will include things like strong policies, regular risk assessments, ways to report, and of course training. Another interesting addition to the Employment Rights Bill is on the issue of non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, which have in the past prevented people from discussing the harassment they've experienced at work. So sexual harassment related disclosures will constitute protected disclosures in the forthcoming legislation. This means sexual harassment disclosures cannot be covered by a non-disclosure agreement. So any dismissal for making a protected disclosure is also treated as automatically unfair in an employment tribunal. We'll also get a Fair Work Agency, which will amalgamate existing employment regulators and provide new powers to investigate and fine employers who don't comply. And it's just worth saying that the Worker Protection Act is really about sparking a culture of change. And I think it's probably worth seeing it as the start of the journey rather than the end point.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great point to end on. Thank you so much for that. Let's just have a look at a couple of the questions that we've had in briefly. Obviously, we will get back to you more detail on these questions. Also, you can check out our blog for answers to all the questions that have come in during this webinar. So the first question we've got up there, how do we overcome management objections from people who think this is just obvious?
Well, look, that's a good question. I'm sure there will be pushback. The first thing to say is there is a duty to take these steps, whether you like it or whether you don't. You have a duty, and increasingly that duty will be more robust. But just thinking about those statistics that Naomi cited earlier, unfortunately, this is something that persists. And for all the training and discussion around it, it still happens. And every time there are surveys, we see these alarming statistics emerge. There's not a week, let's say a month, where we don't hear of stories of sexual harassment. Some are historical, but many of them are much more recent. And just to add a couple of things to that, firstly, as we talk about sexual harassment, we may be all thinking about different examples of what constitutes sexual harassment, maybe the more extreme ones. But the less extreme ones, obviously they're all terrible and wrong, the less extreme ones create a culture in which this type of more extreme behavior can occur. So the more you talk about these things, the more you challenge mindsets and attitudes, that sense of entitlement that is at the heart of this. And protecting staff from harassment also enhances your reputation, which is something you need to think about as well. You want to show to existing employees, because they're watching all the time, that you take these things seriously. Because it's such a difficult thing to report. What if it's your manager or a person in authority who is committing these acts of sexual harassment? Do you come forward? What are the consequences for you? And of course, there's a financial cost to non-compliance. If you aren't taking these proactive steps and someone is successful at an employment tribunal, it will cost you a quarter more than it did before. And the cost of being proactive, when you think about it, doesn't have to be all that expensive at all. Putting in place stricter policies, communicating those regularly, putting posters together maybe with how to report, none of that has to cost much, if anything, really. So there isn't really a financial reason not to do the work and take this seriously.
Absolutely. Well, we are out of time. Thank you very much for that answer. Very, very interesting to hear from you about that. Thank you so much to both our panelists, Maurizio and Naomi. Great to hear all your insights today. Thank you to everyone that came along, for everyone who wrote in questions. We're going to get back on our blog because we're going to post everything with answers there in the next few days. Plus, we can get back to you by email specifically as well if you have a specific question. If you'd like to see anything more about what we've shown today, just write demo into the chat or let us know and we'll be in touch. And thank you again for coming along, for being with us over the last hour, going through what obviously is a difficult situation, but hopefully with this new legislation and with, you know, thinking through the things that we can all do as organizations, we can actually make some difference and make some improvements. So thank you everyone who came along and asked us your questions today. Thank you to Maurizio and Naomi, and we hope to see you again next time on one of our webinars. Thanks for now.